Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Deeran. I'm Director of Reform Scotland. I'm going to play a very minor part in today's event. I'm just going to basically do some introductions. So you're all here today because we have published, Reform Scotland, through its Commission on School Reform, has published the report Absent Minds, which is on the front of a few of the newspaper pages today and leading some of the news bulletins. Seems to be a lot of interest in it. And has obviously revealed some quite alarming statistics about school attendance in Scotland, particularly since lockdown. So it's not our first report on this subject, actually, although the last one didn't get quite the attention this one has got, and I suspect it's unlikely to be our last, given what seems to be the deep-seated nature of this problem. Today's event is going to be chaired by Keir Bloomer, who is also the chair of our Commission on School Reform. Once I hand over to Keir, he will then hand on to Alison Payne, who's our brilliant Director of Research, who did the hard yards on this report and was the author of it. And she'll outline the findings, and then we will go around the members of today's panel for their response, have a bit of a Q&A, and we will take questions from the audience in the latter half of the event. So if you have questions, and I hope you do, please submit them using the chat function on Zoom. That's always the easiest way to get their attention. Yeah, it should be a fascinating debate, and we hope to hear from you as much as you will hear from us. So with that, I'll be quiet and hand over to, can I just ask, actually, if you're not on the panel, could you mute yourself so we avoid any background noise? And that's definitely all I've got to say, and I'll hand over to Keir.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keir Bloomer. I am, as Chris said, the chair of Commission on Education Reform, which is really part of Reform Scotland. Delighted to see so many of you here. We look forward to your questions, and indeed, you're welcome to make comments. And if you know the answer to this problem, this is even better. You can tell us. But in the meantime, I'm going to go straight to Alison Payne. Alison, as Chris said, is the Research Director of Reform Scotland, the author of the report, and she will introduce its findings. Ali.
Thanks, Keir. And I'm aware talking about statistics isn't always the most dynamic thing, so I would encourage you, if you haven't already looked at the report we published today, to please go and look for yourself at the data that, and see why Reform Scotland and the Commission on School Reform are so alarmed about the level of absence in our schools. As Chris said, this isn't the first time that we've raised the issue. Before the pandemic, absence in schools was an issue that the Commission on School Reform was wanting to find out more about. We were aware of reports coming from England highlighting problems and potential solutions, and we wanted to look at the issue in Scotland. And the first sort of obstacle that we came across is the fact that we don't really even have the data. Attendance figures in Scotland are only published once every 2 years as part of the Summary Statistics for Scotland's Schools, and the latest figures simply say that attendance is 92%. But what does that mean? It doesn't tell us whether it's a large number of pupils who are absent not often, or a smaller number who are off school more infrequently. There's no attempt to try and look into the issue further and have a better understanding so that we can reach solutions. So that's why the Commission on School Reform wanted to shine a bit more light on the issue, and we've used freedom of information requests repeatedly to try and do this. So in 2020, we published data showing the growing number of pupils that had attendance of less than 50%. In 2022, we highlighted data showing the number of pupils with attendance levels of less than 90% and less than 80% before the pandemic. And on each occasion, we asked the Scottish Government to properly investigate and analyse the issue, and at a very bare minimum, to commit to publishing the data itself. Unfortunately, it's done neither. So therefore, we resubmitted our freedom of information requests, and the report that we published today provides the data for the last 2 academic years, 2021-22 and 22-23. What it shows is that in 22-23, there were over 210,000 pupils with attendance of less than 90% in Scotland across 29 of the 32 local authority areas that gave us responses for that year, and nearly 80,000 pupils had attendance of less than 80%. Now, attendance of less than 90% means you're missing about a day a fortnight, and attendance of less than 80% means you're regularly missing about a day a week. So this isn't sort of parents taking their children on term time holidays. This is a bigger issue than that. And so what we've done is we've compared the data for those most recent years with the data that we received for the pre-pandemic years. And what we've seen is this big jump in absence. Last year, about 32% of pupils had attendance of less than 90%, and that was up from 21% in 2018-2019. And 12% of pupils had attendance of less than 80%, again up from 7% pre-pandemic. Now, the figures are even more alarming if you break it down into stages. We asked our Freedom of Information requests based on P1 to P4, P5 to P7, S1 to S3, and S4 to S6. And what is clear is there's a big jump in absence figures between primary and secondary school. So for example, last year, 8% of P5 to P7 pupils had attendance levels of less than 80%, but it jumps to 18% for the S1 to S3 cohort. We've also found that there's quite big variations across local authority areas. So in East Dunbartonshire, for example, 6% of S4 to S6 pupils have attendance levels of less than 80%, whereas the figure jumps to 30% in neighbouring West Dunbartonshire. And those are huge, huge variations, and there's clearly a lot more that we need to find out about those figures. Now, unfortunately, there will always be pupils where ill health, family disruption, trauma impact their ability to attend school. One of our concerns about this data is that with more and more pupils having lower attendance figures, it will become harder for schools to first identify and provide support for those that need that early intervention. So there's an awful lot going on there in these figures. There's 10 tables of data that we've published today. And as I said, I really would encourage everybody to go and have a look at that data for yourself. So
thank you very much. Lindsay Patterson was, until comparatively recently, Professor of Education Policy at Edinburgh University, and he is one of our Commission members. Lindsay.
Thank you, Keir. Let me focus on the data aspect, again, just to emphasise the importance of good quality data before we get on to the more politically policy useful things of how to deal with these problems. The first thing to say is the fundamental importance of the distinction that Ali drew there between absence rates and persistent absence. The absent rate is at any given moment, like this Thursday afternoon, what proportion of pupils are not in school that should be in school. And as Ali said, it's around 8%. But persistent absence is people who regularly miss school, such as miss 1 in 10 days or 1 in 5 days. Now, in the Scottish Government's response, for example, this morning, quoted in several newspapers, they completely confuse these two things. And that is in itself dismaying, that the Scottish Government is not, in fact, producing the data that would well inform this debate. But it has to be said in defence of the Scottish Government, actually, that very, very few education systems around the world actually produce the kind of detailed data on persistent absence that the Reform Scotland report today does. The best, in fact, internationally is England. I'll come on to England in a minute, but we used to do this reasonably well in Scotland when we had a regular survey of school leavers, which asked about non-attendance in secondary schools. And as it happens, way back in the late 1970s, just after the move to comprehensive secondary education, the rate of persistent absence that is roughly equivalent to the 10% absent rate that Ali described today was 39%, which is almost exactly the same as the 40% the roughly the same figure that is in the report today. In other words, the rate of persistent absence today takes us right back to the late 1970s, 40 or 50 years ago. That in itself is, of course, dismaying. But what's more, in the period between the late 70s and the first decade of the present century, that persistent absence rate was steadily reduced, mainly due probably to better courses at school, to courses that are more attractive to students, and to better guidance and other kinds of pastoral support from teachers. So it's what's been happening, perhaps mainly because of COVID, but we can discuss this, is wiping out some 40 years of progress in persuading young people that going to school was worth it. Let me then move on to England, because England is actually now a world leader in producing this data. And I know drawing comparisons with England in Scotland is always somewhat controversial, but this really is a good case where what England is doing is worth emulating because it is world leading. England produces the data on persistent absence. That's less than, these are people that are missing a day every fortnight, 10% figure that Ali mentioned. It does this every year. And for example, in 2018 to 19, the rate of persistent absence in England among secondary school pupils was 13%, and last year it was 25%. So the 25% figure last year in England is to be compared with the 40% figure in the report from Reform Scotland today. So the report from Reform Scotland suggests that at secondary school level at least, probably Scotland is doing quite substantially worse than England in getting its young people to engage with school. There's a similar kind of contrast actually at the primary level. What's more, the data in England also allow a breakdown according to various social characteristics. And the key one here is a rough indicator of poverty. Children who are entitled to free school meals are much more likely to be persistently absent than children who are not entitled to free school meals. About 36% of all pupils compared with 22% of all pupils. That's all, both primary and secondary. That, of course, is probably one of the explanations of the variation amongst education authorities that Ali mentioned in her presentation. Let me finish with two further points. Further on the question of providing good quality data to allow this debate to happen. From next year, 2024, the Department for Education in England is going to make all this data available for interactive analysis on their website, on their dashboard, which will allow you, for example, to drill right down into local authority levels and even districts within local authority levels to see what the pattern of persistent absence is locally. Now, that is going to be a tremendous resource for policymakers and researchers in England, and it really is something that perhaps would be desirable here. The final thing to say is, again, also from England, they're also, in addition to everything that I've just described there, which is statistics describing the problem, they're also doing a regular survey which asks pupils and parents what their explanation is of the problem, as well as asking them about a whole lot of other things as well. Now, I would emphasize here, this is information directly from parents and directly from pupils. It's not through the schools. And what the parents especially have reported in the most recent round of that survey that took place in June and was reported a few weeks ago is that mental health and levels of anxiety are apart from actual ill health, physical ill health being off school, the mental health and levels of anxiety are the main reasons why children are not going to school. And perhaps that does suggest the beginnings of an understanding of why this is happening and what could be done to make it better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. The other member of the Commission who's going to make an initial contribution is Carol Ford. Carol was head teacher of Kilmarnock Academy and is a maths teacher by profession. So on you go, Carol.
Well, good afternoon. The statistics are very worrying, but it can be difficult to fully comprehend the impact of such a high level of absence. And from the classroom perspective, I want to illustrate that impact. It goes without saying that individual pupils will be badly affected by poor school attendance, not just in terms of qualifications, but also job opportunities and life skills. They will acquire fewer academic or social skills and are less likely to develop the positive work habits which are necessary for adult life. We know that this will be the case. But the impact of poor attendance goes much wider than simply the individuals themselves. A high level of absence for some pupils affects every young person in the class and the overall performance of Scottish young people. I want to focus on the specific impact of the statistic that 40% of secondary pupils have lower than a 90% attendance rate. In practice, this means that on average, in a class of 30 pupils, it's entirely possible that 12 of them have erratic attendance. There will be classes where the problem is greater and classes where the problem does not exist. But in that average class of 12 pupils with poor or very poor attendance, then in every period, the class teacher has to cater for the 18 who do attend regularly and are ready to move on, the group who have missed a few lessons, a number who have missed many lessons and have developed large gaps in their knowledge, and possibly a school refuser who attends very sporadically indeed. So the question is this: when and how does the teacher introduce a new concept or skill which is based on previous knowledge? How does the teacher move to more complex work if pupils have yet to tackle the simpler material? particularly in subjects which are content heavy, hierarchical in understanding, or dependent on a high level of practical skill, subjects such as maths, physics, biology, foreign languages, computing, technology. The teacher is stretched to their limits, trying to cater for the varying levels of prior knowledge. The best analogy would be like spinning plates, and it is exhausting. Every pupil, good attender or bad, is receiving a less satisfactory educational experience. But the impact is not just on learning. We are all aware of the deterioration in pupil behaviour in schools. At the extreme end, pupil violence against teachers has increased. But the more routine forms of indiscipline include almost constant talking, even when the teacher is speaking, calling out across the class, checking phones or texting, and a low-level defiance, which is the bane of many teachers' professional lives. What better excuse is there for any of these behaviours than to claim, I can't do this, I was off when you taught this? Some pupils are genuinely frustrated by their lack of understanding. Others simply use it to justify their poor behaviour. Whichever it is, the lesson is disrupted. In classroom management terms, while the teacher is helping one group to catch up, the rest of the class have more freedom to misbehave. Erratic attendance exacerbates the behavioural issues. And again, every member of the class is adversely affected. As an aside, the scenario I am describing is certainly one of the reasons that recruiting teacher trainees, particularly in STEM subjects, is proving so difficult. A very experienced teacher will manage the difficulties I am describing, possibly at a cost to their own stress levels, but it is a fairly daunting experience for a new recruit. In the interest of all young people, not just the absentees, it is very important that we identify the causes of the current absence issue and identify practical strategies to improve things. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the input from the Commission, but we are very fortunate to have with us today also Kate Forbes. And perhaps, Kate, you would like to make a few initial comments too, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Thank you very much. And I feel like following Carol Ford, I need to start by paying tribute to teachers across Scotland who have had to navigate the most phenomenal choppy waters in the last few years. But I guess the first question is, why am I interested in this report? And there's three primary reasons why I think all of us should be interested in this report, irrespective of whether we have a speciality in education or not. I think the first is that this is a very critical contribution to what will become a library analysing the generational impact, long-term impact of COVID. And I think that this reveals something quite profound in terms of how COVID has impacted on our young people. We know why we took the measures that we did, but the impact has been catastrophic in some areas. I think the second thing is that the impact on our collective future is determined by what these figures reveal, because how a child learns, the impact of school on their development, on their social abilities, on their skills and so on a generational impact is quite clearly going to shape our economic future and shape the society over the next few years. So indeed, we may have a situation where politicians in 20, 30, 40 years are dealing with particular issues as a result of what these figures indicate. And my third reason is entirely personal. I had 3 teenagers in the house during COVID, and I don't think any of these figures and what they reveal actually come as a surprise, because those figures are critical, and I praise the Commission for identifying and publishing these figures, but not to denigrate them. They only draw us into the conversation. They actually tell us very little about what is driving these figures. And I would wholeheartedly support the need for a pilot or a deep dive into what these figures say, because they are, in my humble opinion, entirely a symptom rather than a cause. And until you deal with the cause, we'll continue to talk about the symptom. So my last few comments are about the why. And in the absence of any conclusive reasons, although our speakers so far have quite clearly unpacked some of the potential reasons, but in the absence of conclusive reasons for what's driving these figures, I asked those very same teenagers who themselves saw 3 years of disrupted education. And I categorized the 3 primary reasons they gave me for why they think persistent absence figures are so high. And I wanted to share them with you quickly now in the hope that it unpacks some of the questions. The first is, as Lindsay Patterson said, stress and anxiety. I think anybody who lived with teenagers during those years, we will be familiar with the huge increase in anxiety, even among students who had never displayed any anxious tendencies before. I mean, you think about it, the social impact of masks in school, returning to friendship groups after living on social media, the uncertainty of whether school would be on or off and then off again, schools actually being unable to help with those new issues that were arising because students themselves didn't understand the impact of loneliness, of isolation, of uncertainty, of anxiety. And even for those students who were already tapped into support, counsellors and so on, they lost support, they lost contact with many of the counsellors and lost that personal relationship with teachers. And for us as adults, clearly the impact was significant too. But for young people, you know, the young people you're talking about who are now in 4, 5 and 6, S4, 5 and 6, think about it, they were in S1, S3 at the very crux of that adjustment to school. And I think that we can't get away from the fact that that is a massive driver, and they are still dealing with the impact of that. The second category, which I'll race through a little bit more quickly, my teenagers, my resident experts, categorized as lost discipline. And that's using it in the old-fashioned sense of the word. 3 years of very inconsistent schooling, which is not in any way to criticize teachers who did their level best. But again, the inconsistency of work readjusting to a school environment, which is far more rigid, far more strict, requiring you to sit at a desk, requiring you to be in situ for a particular time in the morning. And alongside that, a loss of drive. Exams were obviously disrupted, and the importance of setting goals. And this was a quote almost verbatim, that there was a loss of drive, and children and young people, pupils need to know what they're working towards in order to motivate them to get really stuck in. Now, I am not saying that issues still apply. What I am saying is that 3 years of dealing with these issues is inevitably going to have a longer term impact. There's going to be a long tail on it that young people are still dealing with. And I think the general sympathy from parents and from teachers meant that there was perhaps lower expectations about children being present at school rather than being able to learn in other ways, including online. My last point is perhaps a little bit more controversial, and that's the esteem placed on in-person learning. You know, we went through a period, and again, I'm going to quote verbatim here, teenagers felt like school wasn't as necessary as it used to be, because in some cases they'd missed so much, and in other cases they had adjusted to learning online entirely. So they wondered what the point was in actually going into school. And again, that will have a tail, and teachers are working against the current, as it were, when it comes to that. Obviously, some of the online learning was absolutely exceptional, and other online learning was impacted by inequalities, by the ability to learn at home, by the disruption in terms of the family situation. And I think, you know, having introduced home learning as a concept, there's a harder job for teachers to remind pupils and families that actually being in the classroom really matters. So I am certainly not an expert, but as a decision maker, I think we all have a vested interest in understanding this so that we can solve it, because it isn't just about school. It's also about our children's well-being, their anxiety levels and mental health. But more than that, it's also about what the future of our society and our economy look like. So thank you for having me on the panel.
Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to receive questions and contributions from anybody now.
Here, I think there's a question from Alex Linklater. Alex,
Yes.
do you want to ask your question?
Oh, hello. Yes, can you hear me? I've got very bad Wi-Fi where I am at the moment.
We can hear you.
Great. Thank you. Well, actually, Lindsay Patterson has given me a provisional answer, but the thing that strikes me about the problem of absenteeism is that, as I know from the special needs sector, you know, they are almost always school refusers before they end up in what is in Scotland, in my very limited experience, very inadequate provision for kids with special needs learning difficulties. So I was just curious to know how much of, I mean, this is clearly a widespread problem which has been addressed by the speakers in various different ways, but just in terms of how much the Scottish educational system might actually adapt to address it with provision for additional support needs kids. Is that something that that could usefully be addressed in terms of dealing with the problem?
Thank you. Rather than just have a back and forth, I'll take another couple of questions. First, Gillian Mathewson, and then Martin Hayward. Gillian.
Hi, good afternoon. So I am a parent of a child who has 0 attendance. I am also a principal teacher of mathematics. And I actually put a question in the chat, but I wanted to find out whether or not the Commission were aware of a condition called PANS PANDAS. So PANS PANDAS is a neuropsychiatric condition which is triggered usually by an infection. So it could be strep. In our case, we believe it was COVID, asymptomatic COVID. And it's led to a series of all sorts of different symptoms, anxiety being a very strong one. My child's also developed tics, OCD, eating issues, and a variety of other things. Now, we were referred to CAMHS. We were told it was anxiety, and it was through my own personal research that I actually found out about the condition. It's something that is not well recognised in the UK. There was a debate in Westminster in September this year where it was discussed, and there was representatives from the SNP there. But so there's a kind of network of people who they're trying to develop understanding. But it's one of the items that was discussed at that Westminster debate was whether or not this could be something that's behind some of the attendance issues with children in school, where they do develop significant anxiety, can't go to school, but it's actually thought of as just anxiety, and they're struggling after COVID, because actually this condition can affect, it's estimated from America that it's 1 in 200 young people can be affected by this. And so, you know, it could be that even if, you know, half of the kids, it could be something like this, and it's something that's treatable. They can receive antibiotics, but at the moment you can't get treatment in the UK.
Right,
So
thank you. Martin Hayward.
Thank you. I put this in the chat as well. I really welcome the publication of the report, opening a lid on this important issue, and the reference that it contains to pupil characteristics and collecting data which help to illuminate the problem. It's just a reminder that both Scottish Government and educational authorities are required by the Public Sector Equality Duty to monitor any work in this area by relevant protected characteristics, and that's to eliminate unlawful discrimination, promote equality of opportunity, and foster good relations. The Fairer Scotland duty would also be relevant to any decisions taken about work that was going to be done to address this. As other speakers have said, this is a strategic and long-term issue that's going to affect the way the Scottish population experiences life in the future. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I've got 3 further questioners at the moment, but just before taking them, does anyone from the panel wish to comment in any way on what's just been said? Carol, Lindsay, briefly both.
I have to admit, I hadn't heard of this specific issue that's just been mentioned there, but in the report, we do comment that actually one of the reasons that we need the investigations and analysis of data is to identify pupils that do need extra help and do need support. Now, we know that the support network in Scottish schools has diminished. There are fewer support staff there than there were previously, and we do need more of that. So while I can't comment on the specific issue that was raised there, in general terms, we need to identify the reasons why people aren't attending, and if it is a neurological issue, if it's a mental health issue, if it's anxiety, actually do something about it. Now, as a head teacher, I had a lot of experience of referring children to CAMHS, and it was an extremely frustrating experience. And I think it's been an extremely frustrating experience for many, many years. But maybe we now need to seriously tackle this. We've kind of pushed it down the road for many years, the fact that there is not a lot of mental health support for adolescents particularly. And it's maybe something we now have to seriously get to grips with. If this is a fundamental reason why a large number of pupils are not attending school, we need to do something about it, and we need to stop talking about it and actually get these support mechanisms in place.
Lindsay?
Yes, just to emphasise here that every individual case of the pupils absent is a unique case. That's been very clear already from the examples quoted in the questions and quoted in the chat. And of course, the more that there is variation in the uniqueness of all these individual pupils, the more demands on teachers' time and schools' time this places at a time when teachers are already having to cope with increased workloads, partly itself to do with the aftermath of COVID. So I'm afraid that, unfashionable though it may be to say this, that one of the only responses that can be made for this is an enormous increase in the number of professionals whose life is dedicated to giving individual pastoral support to pupils. These could be teaching professionals, but they also, of course, could be NHS professionals with appropriate counselling experience. That is unavoidably very expensive, but this isn't going to be solved in any other way because there's no blanket solution, because every one of these 80,000 individuals is unique.
Thank you. The next 3 questioners in this order, if you please, Colin S, Currar 12, and Gillian Evans. So, Colin.
Hello. Can you hear me here?
Yes.
Yeah, because just took it off mute. It was carrying on a little bit from what Carol was saying there, because my original question was, as a third sector organisation who are working in a partnership with Glasgow City Council to address the needs of the most the children who are most impacted by chronic non-attendance, particularly those who are identified as experiencing higher levels of anxiety and mental health challenges. what we're finding is, despite, you know, taking the approaches which are compassionate, nurturing, engaged, there's still those who, from a third sector perspective, we don't have the capacity to support because they need a much deeper dive, to use that term, into support for their fairly significant mental health issues. And this really speaks to what Carol was saying about those services which are available to support children who really need a higher level of intervention, who really need, you know, a deeply therapeutic approach to their support. We know the frustrations that you're talking about, Carol, around, you know, the length of time it takes to get a referral to, you know, action with CAMHS. We you know, I would think in other contexts we would probably find those kind of waiting lists unacceptable, because when you think about it, the proportion of time that young people wait, maybe 2-3 years to actually be seen by CAMHS, to be supported in the ways that I've described, is a huge proportion of their life, and it's a huge proportion of time and their life's experience, where they remain unsupported or inappropriately supported. So my question in the chat earlier on is there any indication that the Scottish Government, for instance, or the NHS is able to, you know, focus on providing more resources, you know, a greater focus on the needs of children and adolescents' mental health?
Thank you. The next person is Currer 12.
Yes,
Hi there, I hope you can hear me. This is Rebecca Curran. I'm a journalist with BBC Scotland. I think that this question is probably directed to you, Carol. Obviously, data collection is difficult if it's not done nationally. And forgive my ignorance on this, because I don't have a child at school, but is that something that is done individually by schools, in that, you know, when your child doesn't attend school, their parents are asked for a reason and that is recorded, and therefore potentially, you know, the data is out there, it just needs to be collated? That would be my question.
Thank you. And the last one in this group, Gillian Evans.
I put my comments in, and I was reflecting on that there's been a change of school management and structure, particularly secondary schools. I myself had to take my children out of school to protect their mental health, and I'm home educating them because the school couldn't even teach my son how to read. But a third of children in Scotland don't even obtain a single Hired. So there's lots of children in school who are not going to get an academic qualification to a higher level. But my local school in Prestwick went from a 600 to a 1,200 pupils, with a high percentage of them not going to get a higher qualification. And then I'm getting feedback, my children are not in that school, but I'm getting feedback from other parents that they're going to take their children out of school to go to college at 16, because there's like drug issues, there's behavioural issues. And it said in an old book that schools should be limited to 600 for the headmaster to be able to control discipline, and to have 1,200 young people with overstretched staff, with a headmaster that you probably don't even see. I used to see my headmaster and you would be terrified of him. But it's kind of like that schools have been made so big that that's causing the anxiety, and children are not finding schools pleasant places with a number of children, the number of issues, drug taking in playgrounds, and then being challenged. The only thing the school are strict on is your uniform, and chastising children over their uniform. And then I wondered also if Reform Scotland had done a freedom of information as to how many parents are getting taken to court for their children not attending school, because I see a lot on boards, and especially also English parents, that they're quick to try and get them into court and fine them for their children not attending school. And the parents have got children with issues of they should be in CAMHS, they need additional support. But also the parents are taken to court quite readily. And I think in Scotland, councils do take a lot of parents and fine them for their children. So the data must be there, because the schools know whose children are not attending.
I think Alison will respond to you on that last point.
Yeah, thanks. We actually, in our previous report, we asked each of the local authorities about what action they were taking and whether referrals to children panels, and also whether there'd been any actions in court, as you say. And the latest figures that we had, so that would have been pre-pandemic, but there were 2 councils that had taken anybody to court at all in the previous 5 years that we'd asked about. And I think it had been less than a handful of cases. So councils, we found from when we did our previous FOIs for the 5 years going back from 21 backwards, there, as I say, there had been very, very few cases of anybody taken to court for non-attendance.
And I think I'm correct in saying that at the time when we actually got those answers, there were no councils taking any action. So we are in the position at the moment, whether for good or ill, that the course of action which is contained in the relevant statutes is now simply not being used by the local authorities. We have, I think I'll take the 2 questions which are outstanding at the moment, because I'll give the panel a word towards the end. Caroline Ferguson and then Charlie Rayburn. Caroline.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm the CEO of a youth charity, RUTS. We work across Scotland in various different schools, mainly the Lothians, and we're finding this as a huge issue. We work mainly in the schools. We have I've got a head teachers meeting next week with Midlothian Council, kind of looking at this issue. Also got meetings set up with East Lothian Council to look and see how the third sector can provide some solutions in this area. But I do think we're also underestimating the economic climate that we're living in today, and how that's affecting attendance at school as well, because, you know, we are talking about the lowest area for the lowest young people within this in terms of the IMT areas. And that does also affect school uniforms. I know the schools are doing a lot to kind of tackle this, but I think school meals, uniforms, everything like that has to be taken into consideration. We have the policies, no one left behind. We've got everything there in place, but we also are in a situation where third sector organisations are struggling with funding to be able to operate this in these schools. So not only are teachers under pressure, all of our organisations are under pressure with staffing and cuts to be able to provide the support to schools. But I definitely think alternatives to curriculum to encourage young people to come back into school, to have fun as well. Learning should be fun for everybody. I think we've come away from the fact, you know, looking at academic attainment. Sorry, my line might be breaking up, but that's, I'll finish there, otherwise I'll go into a rant.
Thank you. Charlie Rayburn.
Probably quite timely, because those last few sentences were where I was going to speak a little bit about that. First of all, can I say congratulations to Reform Scotland for having this continual focus on the school world, because it's very helpful. Second, I think there's the issue of COVID. And unlike Lindsay, I think there are some of our neighbouring countries been doing a hell of a lot of work on research on what has happened in COVID in schools. I'm dealing particularly with Denmark and Holland, and I know that they have very detailed research evidence on what has happened in school. So in one sense, I think we've got to talk about the sort of COVID effect. And, you know, my colleague in New Zealand, who used to be the head of school sport in New Zealand, just retired, he took part in a conference we had during COVID. And the New Zealanders put the sporty stuff right at the center of the curriculum at the start of COVID. Why? Because they wanted the children to connect. And it was the business of finding a bit of enthusiasm through a little bit of fun, getting an interest, linking with adults, not the iPhone, that was making the big difference. And I think, you know, there's a lot to be said, in my view, that we need to connect up. And so I would be saying, again, if you look at Danish example, they have the opportunity now to have residential experiences, sometimes quite long periods of time, where they might take a theme, sport or dance or something else, and they learn a lot about life and they connect. I think perhaps in this COVID period, maybe we could start doing some things like that, and particularly looking in school areas where there have been real problems. Second point would be to say that we need to listen to the children a lot more, I think, because we're seeing a big difference between the school figures as we were hearing at the start. You know, there are very big differences between school. We need to find out why are those differences there. And I'm also aware that the staff are under so much pressure. At one point I was an advisor in the old days in PE. I eventually decided in the special ed world, we needed soft play areas for staff as well as for kids. And I think that's probably just as important right now as before. So I think, can we listen carefully to find out why is it those schools are doing better than other schools? Let's see if we can. And my last point would be on the curriculum generally. I think there are huge issues to do with the Scottish system that need to long-term looking at. And I know that's what Reform Scotland is looking at too. But I think at the moment, I have 3 sisters, and I've always been aware that the school system in Scotland doesn't suit boys. They grow up at a different pace, not interconceptual learning as a general rule at S3 level. SCRE years ago identified that, but we haven't really, in my view. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we've just got 2 questions at the moment, one from Alan Sutherland, one from Jim McCall. So take those 2 and then perhaps proceed to the winding up, since we're running out of time. So Alan first and then Jim.
Well, my initial question was, can you hear me okay, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. My initial question was, what role do parents have in this? But having listened to this, you know, I think there's a danger that, as in many other areas of policy, COVID gets blamed for a lot of things, and I'm sure it has made things worse. But these issues, I think, were always ongoing long before that. I'm a product of the golden years of Scottish education. My kids are a product of it just when it was getting to its fag end in the mid-90s. And I've got 4 grandchildren under 3 who'll be going to school in the next few years, and their parents are wondering where on earth they're going to send them to school. But to come back to the issue, one of the things you talk about is this area of mental health, and it affects the violence, I suppose, as well as the lack of attendance and maybe even performance. And I wonder, that's where it comes back to parenting. And I'm sure all parents want their kids to do well, but for one reason, I think somebody mentioned about the support, external support for children. That used to be the parents' job. Didn't need any, you know, my mother used to sit and do my homework, but my mother wasn't working when I was at primary school, but she was at secondary. And I think a lot of parents have to work. There's 6 times more single parent families in Scotland now than there was in 1971. All these things have an effect, and it's such a huge problem. I don't know where you would start, but it was interesting. In the last 24 hours, we've had your report come out. The Daily Record's been making headlines about Jenny Gilruth's summit on violence. And unbelievably, on debate night last night, they were even talking about the sinister sex education policies, which again are confusing a lot of kids. So there's an awful lot of things there, and parents should be more involved in it. And where they are more involved in it or got issues with it, for example, sex education, they're not allowed to find out what their kids are getting taught. And these things have been going on for a long time and getting worse. And, you know, some of it's reasons, some of it's excuses. But the way somebody said about the future of the whole country and Scotland as a nation, it doesn't look good because of what we're producing out of our schools just now, one way or another.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, just to talk about the sort of group that I was focused on, and between 14 and 19, 2014, 2019, we ran a pilot for 5 years on a school for 14 to 16-year-olds. We were told by the high teachers, the school teachers, that they could, head teachers, that they could identify who was going to drop out, you know, who the non-attenders, who were going to fail with no education, employment or training needs. They were going to be NEET. And we set up this junior college. We called that junior college so that it didn't have a stigma. And it had huge success rates. Now, all of these kids were nominated by the schools around the south of Glasgow. We gave them breakfast, we picked them up, we gave them breakfast, we gave them lunch. We had 3 half days a week at the local further education college to give them vocational skills, and we have a very high success rate. And these were people who, young kids who were from areas of multiple deprivation. They didn't have the input at home, and they needed to be given that elsewhere. And with all due respect, the teachers in schools have an impossible opportunity of trying to help them, because they are disruptive in class. They're the people that cause the damage to the others, and if you can take them out and deal with them, we did in a different way to school. We gave them maths, English, science, and IT, 3 vocational subjects, half days a week, and then life skills. We had an ex-military person in to take them on Outward Bound and so on. These people were, the change in them was outstanding. Keir was involved in that. I think Lindsay had seen them as well. And, it was supposed to be after 5 years that if this was proved successful, we would embed it in the Scottish education system. And it, like all pilots, it was ignored, and we've moved on. And there's no use doing more pilots. There's no use putting kids and parents in court, because these are families that can't deal with this kind of thing. That's not the way to solve it. The way to solve it is deal with these people in a way that we come up with a good solution. And maybe Keir or Lindsay, who had and witnessed the solution over, but there's a real need for these young people to be looked after. And all it needed in financial terms was allocate them over the 4 years, the equivalent of 6 years cost of education. So give them, if it's 7,000 a year, give them 6 times 7, which is 42,000, and let us use the 2 years that they're not there over, or the 4 years, if we take them out at 14, let's use it over 2 years, and that solves the problem. 20% of the young people that leave at the statutory leaving age across Scotland never identify with any further support mechanisms that are in place, any skills development. They disappear off the radar. These are the people that end up in drugs and violence, and more importantly, a poor quality of life for themselves and their families. And I think there's a big difference can be made to that group. And I suspect that group, that 20% is worse now. And it was fairly consistent, whether you looked at Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, wherever. It's a high level. It's been going on for 50 years. We've tried all sorts of pilots. Nobody follows it through. We put quite a bit of money behind it privately, spent over, I think it was about 6.5 million over 5 years. Outstanding outcome for these young people. And when you see them today, you would be proud of what happened to them. But they need a different type of approach. And just quickly, I'd go in and have breakfast with them some mornings, just have a chat, and I asked them after they'd been in for a short period of time, what is it that's different here? Because we had people that hadn't attended in the last year at secondary, full attendance. We had people who got hires at the end of 4th year, English hire, that wasn't going to get anything at their school. Now, the answer was, people care about us here. Now, it's not that they're not cared about it at school, but they're in an environment where the only way they know how to react is, to be disruptive. And the other thing that we did when they come in was we tested their literacy and numeracy. They had this is 14-year-olds, a literacy age of 6.5. So we had to come up with a very specific support system through the English teacher to get their literacy age up. and it was fairly straightforward and easy to do in a 6-week period. But you wouldn't be able to identify in the schools because there are too many of them, they're disruptive, and they feel that they're not loved.
Thank you, Jim. We're really more or less out of time. I think I will ask the members of the panel just a sentence or two each. Go in reverse order. Kate?
Whether COVID is blamed or not, the impact is so immense, it would be a miracle if it didn't have an impact on education. Secondly, whatever the cause, it's quite clear that health and inequalities are a contributing factor. And I get very exercised at the assumption that teachers are expected to be social workers, educators, parents, friends, mental health experts. If it isn't just an educational matter, we absolutely need to build the services around these young people. And that includes the low-level issues before they escalate. There's a great model in the Western Isles, drop-in centres for mental health. You don't need to get referred through a convoluted process for the psychologists and so on. You can access that help to avoid it escalating and getting worse. That compresses a bunch of paragraphs into a couple of sentences in the spirit of managing the time.
Thank you. Skillful use of commas and subordinate clauses, however. Carol?
Well, there was quite a lot in that last section there, covering a number of areas, and I just want to comment on a couple of them. One is about pilot programmes. I share the frustration about the pilot programme system that often occurs in Scottish education. We're calling for pilots and this to actually look at what works, but only if they're properly evaluated and the bits that are working are actually disseminated across the system. I must admit, there is an education authority in this country that teachers refer to as the Ryanair Authority, because they've got more pilots than Ryanair, and I'll not say which one it is, but very rarely are they actually implemented, or if they are implemented, they're actually destroyed in the implementation process. And the second one that I just want to touch on briefly is talking about the curriculum that is actually offered to children in secondary school. And I agree that there is a section of the school population for whom the curriculum is really not totally suitable. And I say this about Scotland, but also about the UK in general, that our approach to vocational education has been piecemeal and, you know, a bit of dabbling here and dabbling there. It's never been systematic and purposeful like the German vocational education system is, and we need to do something about that. And I've noticed that actually Andy Burnham in Manchester has identified that the route from school, if you leave at 16 and on into adulthood, is not clear for many pupils. And he's actually instituting his own system, his own vocational educational system and qualifications to try and make it easier for that group of pupils. But I agree that we need systemic change in the offering of the curriculum to quite a section of the Scottish population. The final thing I would say is the point that was made about large secondary schools. I agree. I have taught personally in 10 different secondary schools, mostly in the central belt of Scotland, and the size matters. And I think, particularly for children coming from more disadvantaged backgrounds, very large secondary schools are not the answer.
Thank you. Lindsay?
Thank you. Let me just emphasise again the importance of system-wide data. Charlie Rayburn rightly picked me up on not saying very clearly what I was intending to say about that. It is absolutely the case that around Europe there are many good research projects on the impact of COVID. There are very few, in fact there's none except in England, on the impact of COVID on persistent absence, because in no other place other than England is there system-wide data on persistent absence. And the reason why system-wide data is important, let me illustrate that actually, if I may go back to the three hypotheses, as it were, that Kate mentioned at the beginning as possible explanations: stress, a loss of a sense of discipline, and a diminution of the status placed on in-person attendance. Now, no proper research design could investigate and test these hypotheses without system-wide data, because without system-wide data, you cannot control for the counterfactuals. You can't say this is happening here because it's not happening there, or if there's a particular regime in a school, then that works and the other ones don't work. In other words, you need the control groups, you need the valid comparison groups, which have to be highly complex because education always is. So my point about that was simply that we need system-wide data as they have in England, and as often, for example, produces excellent research in the admirable Education Policy Institute in London. We need system-wide data if we're ever going to draw valid, generalizable conclusions that can influence policy and practice.
Right. Thank you very much. I think that brings our event to a close. Very grateful to you all for attending and for the various contributions that you've made. I hope you think it has been worthwhile. Thank you.